Hello and welcome to Brain in a Vat. Today we have David Shoemaker with us, and David's going to talk about humor. David, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So at the very early stages when I was thinking about the book and humor, I was at one of my favorite bars in New Orleans with a good friend, Mark, and I casually mentioned to him, I think I'm going to write my next book on humor. And without missing a beat and with a straight face, he said, well, that assumes you know something about it. Now, I thought that was hilarious, but then I started thinking about why. It sounds as if he's insulting me, right? And if he had said straightforwardly, um, you shouldn't be writing a book on humor because you're just not funny, then it would be an insult and it wouldn't have been funny. So I realized, of course, the insult is a faux insult. But then the question arises, what makes a faux insult funny? Um, it has something to do with the way in which we have a certain kind of relationship with one another. So now we'll veer off into some hypotheticals. If I were talking to Mark and I said, I think I'm going to write a book about humor, and a stranger who's sitting next to us at the bar turns to me and says, but that assumes you know something about it. That's not funny. That's just weird or creepy. But then if it's instead of a stranger, it's my nemesis, a colleague of mine who has been my enemy. And then that person leans in and says, well, that assumes you know something about it. Well, now it is funny, but it is an insult at this point. So this got me thinking about trying to figure out the ways in which what makes these kinds of remarks funny. And it has something to do with relationships. And Mark and I were friends, and I knew that he didn't mean it, and he knew that I knew that he didn't mean it, and so forth and so on. This is very familiar to friendship. Now think of a few other possible variations on this. So suppose I say I'm thinking about writing a book on humor, and Mark rushes to say, hey, I'm just kidding here, but that assumes you know something about it. Well, the just kidding here kills the humor, seems to me, but it also indicates that without the just kidding, he was going to say something that was going to be deception of some kind. And typically deception is wrong, immoral. I mean, maybe I've written 5 books on humor and they've all been failures, and no one has bought them, and they were completely unfunny. And I say, I'm going to write a 6th book on humor. And he says, I get what you're after now. Give the people more of what they don't want. Well, that stings me. It's a kind of mock, and it stings me a little bit. It's going to hurt a little bit, but it's still funny. Or finally, he says, Shoemaker, huh? That's a German name. Yeah, the Germans are very well known for their senses of humor. Well, that's trades on an ethnic stereotype. And that's supposed to be typically wrong. So in thinking about these little exchanges, these interpersonal exchanges, some of them are funny, some of them aren't. Very often it depends on the relationship that we're in. Very often it depends on the intentions that we have. And also there are some immoral features of some of these wisecracking exchanges that are the exact features that make the thing funny. So there's this tight, really interesting relationship, I think, between morality and humor. And it comes out just by thinking of a variety of variations on this one little incident. So that's what got me thinking about the issues, and that's why I wanted to write about them.
Well, it's a wonderful book. People listening should already be able to tell that I'm not Mark. Jason and Mark kindly asked me to fill in today as guest host. And one thing that's so wonderful about this book, David, is it's not about humor in the typical sense. It's about, as you mentioned, wisecracks specifically. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what wisecracks are and how it's different from, say, pre-planned stand-up routines. And also why we should think that this has any bearing on ethics at all. Why not think of little wisecracks between friends as being something so minor or trivial as to be outside the domain of morality completely?
Once I started doing research on humor, the academic literature on humor is all about jokes. Now, there's a reason for that. They're easily available. There are joke books. There are all sorts of jokes on the internet and so forth. And so you can examine them and ask people what they think about them. And that's what's occurred. And so when people talk about things like immoral jokes or immoral kinds of humor, they're talking about jokes. Jokes are prepared. They're canned material. They are monologues. So if I'm talking with you, you say, hey, did you hear the one about, okay, now I have to sit back and listen to you tell the setup, the premise, the punchline, and then ha ha ha. Now we go back to our conversation. So they interrupt conversations. What I'm interested in are what I'm calling wisecracks, which are deeply interpersonal. They are part of conversations. They are ways in which we interact with one another. They involve banter, teasing, ball busting, mockery, prankery, and so forth and so on. They're very familiar in our interpersonal lives. And as it turns out, they make up about 90% of the amusement in our actual lives. So it's actually kind of rare that we are presented with jokes. We may seek out a Netflix comedy special on a Friday night or something, or watch Saturday Night Live. But most of the humor in our lives comes from interaction with others as part of a back and forth banter. That's the kind of thing that I found deeply interesting because we're making wisecracks with each other. And it's with that morality is, I think, implicated. So what we're doing is actually treating each other in certain kinds of ways when we're interacting with them with humor. And as a result, morality is implicated. So we all know if we've taken the wisecrack too far. We're part of this amusement party that we're having with one another, and then I just take it one level up, and now you're stung and you're hurt, you're offended, you stomp off angrily. Well, that's a kind of anger that is the kind of response that we have when people do things that are immoral. And so maybe what it was that made my wisecrack funny was precisely the thing that made you angry. And it wouldn't have been funny if you weren't angry, if you didn't have a reason to be angry. And so that's terribly fascinating to me, the way in which these two domains are very heavily interact with one another. And as I found out as I was doing my research, to have a good sense of humor requires, in part, having a good sense of morality and vice versa. So I think they're deeply intertwined. It's not this lighthearted little thing like it seems, that there are all sorts of values and benefits to engaging in the wisecracking life, just like there are, of course, all sorts of values that are important to the moral life, and they intersect in really interesting ways.
So it's such a fascinating topic, partly because it seems to be very topical at the moment in the culture wars. One view is that there is no amount of offense that is illegitimate to give through a joke or a wisecrack. So that's one position, which some comedians have adopted. So like Louis C.K. has adopted that position. And basically the position is no matter what I talk about, I should be allowed to talk about it and it is funny. Then you get the other extreme, which is if a joke offends me, then it's not funny and you shouldn't give it. What is your position? Is it somewhere between the two?
It is somewhere between the two. So I label the first kind of person the buffoon. And this is the person who's constantly saying, oh, come on, it was funny. And so to the extent that it was funny, it erases all sins. And then on the other hand, there are the people that I label prigs, who think whenever there's some kind of offense or some kind of meanness or sting in any kind of wisecrack, then the humor is completely off the table. It can't be funny. And I think both of these are serious mistakes. The way to get there is by understanding that there are different kinds of value domains at work here. There's the comic domain, and there are certain things that make things funny. And then there's the moral domain, and there are certain things that make things anger-worthy, immoral. And because they intersect, then there are going to be some reasons from each domain that are going to be pertinent. And sometimes reasons from the comic domain actually can outweigh the reasons that are coming in from the moral domain, so that amusement is the proper all things considered response. And sometimes the moral outweighs the comic. And so the proper all things considered response is a kind of moral anger or upset. But that's not to deny that both reasons are still in play. And I think that's the mistake that both the prigs and the buffoons are making. The prigs are saying, look, if there's any immoral stuff here, then all the funny is out. There are no reasons for amusement anymore. And the buffoon is saying, no, as long as there's comic reasons, then all the moral reasons for anger are out. And that's false too. They're both denying what I want to insist are ever-present reasons. And they just may be outweighed in certain circumstances. So both of the views are mistaken. I think both of the views represent a kind of both a bad sense of humor and a bad sense of morality. The badness here can be taken in two ways. So I have bad eyesight. I'm starting to have bad hearing, but there's nothing pejorative about saying that it's a poor sense of sight, poor sense of hearing. And that's because the capacities I've got to become more impaired. That's the case for some people. So members of the dark triad, psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians, they have this poor sense of humor and a poor sense of morality, but it's in virtue of their empathy impairments. And it may be that there are other people who have certain kinds of other impairments that give them poor senses of humor and poor senses of morality in that descriptive sense. But there's some people who have functional capacities, and they're able to pick up the various kinds of reasons that are in different domains, and they improperly discount them. And that's why I use the pejorative for them, prigs and buffoons.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in how to weigh the reasons against one another. And I'm also interested in figuring out what the humorous reasons are. And so one view that you consider is that, it's if people find it funny, it's funny, like a pure subjectivism. You reject that. And then the other end is there's just objective facts about what's funny. And if you are responding to your reasons in the right sort of way, you would just recognize those objective facts and you reject that as well. So how do you determine what the humorous reasons are in your view and the strength of the reasons?
So this is enormously complicated. Again, all the literature on this has been on jokes, but I think it carries over to humor generally. And there have been a variety of theories about what makes things funny. And there are maybe 4 or 5 general properties that people have offered, and none of them work individually. So the leading theory of humor is an incongruity theory. And it says, here's where these are objective properties in the world. When there's a mismatch between expectations and reality, let's say, or there's a pattern that has been disrupted, that's incongruous. And once we see that property, then that's what makes things funny. Well, that's just false. There are lots of incongruous things that aren't funny. A Salvador Dali painting. Here's one, 1, 3, 5, 7, 10. Ooh, isn't that hilarious? I've upset the pattern. So lots of things are not funny that are nevertheless incongruous, and there are incongruous things that aren't. The other kinds of theories that have been offered include recognition of a superiority relationship. This was offered by Hobbes. So something is funny just in case it involves a recognition of an eminence in myself, as he puts it. That I'm superior to someone else. Well, sometimes that accounts for things like insults and mockery and put downs and so forth, but there's lots of other humor that doesn't properly capture. Another theory is incongruity resolution, and you can see that there are going to be counterexamples there. I consider whether or not we could throw all of these properties into the kitchen sink, or include the kitchen sink, or maybe it's everything but the kitchen sink. And even there are counterexamples, and the problem is that none of these theorists can explain when and why something that has incongruity and superiority is funny and when it's not. So that there's objective properties that people have offered, and none of them individually or even together, I think, work to explain all instances of humor. So then you might think, well, it's just all subjective. It's all just a matter of what I find funny. But that can't be true either if we pay attention to the reasons that we give each other. We engage in comic disagreement all the time. My wife does not understand why I find certain, the Ministry of Silly Walks on Monty Python funny. And I can't understand why she finds certain things funny as well. And so we have genuine disputes. So she'll say, that's not funny. I don't know why you're why you find it funny. It's not funny. I say, well, it is. And I point to various properties, and that's not sufficient to do the trick. But we're genuinely disagreeing with one another. A purely subjectivist view says there's no such thing as genuine comic disagreement. So I want to take all of these data points seriously, that on the one hand, we have genuine comic agreement and disagreement. And on the other hand, trying to identify any specific property in the world that in and of itself can make things funny is a failure. So what I try to do is draw from David Hume and say, look, there's a kind of combination here that surely what we find funny or the amusing has to have some kind of matchup with human sensibilities. It matches up to the way we've been built. So the way we get there is by looking at our senses of humor and trying to clear away certain factors to make sure that the sense of humor is developed, that it's refined, that it's unobscured. There are all sorts of things that can obscure our vision of the comic properties in the world, including ideological bias. And if we can clear away that stuff, then we're going to come close, I think, a kind of hypothetical near convergence on what we find funny. And that's because we share, as humans, the emotion of amusement. And we have senses of humor. We can recognize that some people's senses of humor are better than others. So in certain circumstances, incongruity helps to make things funny. In certain circumstances, superiority helps to make things funny. But it's only when we engage with it, with our sensibility, with our sense of humor, that we can see by our own lights when these things hit. So as I say, it's a very complicated story, but it's a deeply human story. I'm plumping for a kind of comic realism that some things are genuinely funny, and we are having genuine disagreements about them. But also, we can only make sense of it ultimately by focusing on our responses of amusement. So it's a thoroughly response-dependent story, but that nevertheless generates real, true humor.
So if I could follow up on that briefly, does that mean if our nature changed such that we didn't respond to anything, even in ideal circumstances, in a humorous or amused way, that there wouldn't be anything that was in fact funny?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And then what if we only responded to, I don't know, unjustifiably mean or like racist or sexist content in a way with amusement and nothing else? Or are you wanting to say there the immoralness of that prevents it from being funny? That's like a constraint on the sort of standard that we're appealing to.
Yeah, I think so. So it's on the one hand, it's an anthropocentric view. It's pitched to human beings, and we have a distinctive kind of sensibility, and the funniness of things in the world is a function of the sensibilities that we've got. Now, for thousands of years, human beings were finding things funny that I don't think are funny. That there were Romans who would sit in the Colosseum and watch Christians who had their legs broken trying to get away from lions. And the lions would, of course, devour them, as the Romans sat there howling with laughter. I don't think the fact that the Romans found it funny makes it funny. And that's because I think there has to be a developed, refined, and unobstructed sense of humor that does the work here. But what's crucial is that I think having a good sense of humor requires having a discriminating sense of empathy. And that's the connector between the domain of humor and the domain of morality. And so if we were built such that we had no empathy, and we found, so they were all psychopaths, right? And we found all of these horrifying things funny, we'd be very different creatures. And it may be that they have a theory of humor for them, but it's no longer the kind of humor that we have, which is informed by empathy, which is also what informs morality. So because those two domains are, for us humans, thoroughly intertwined, then I think that if there were a group of human-like people who found all of these horrifying things funny, then they're just not us.
So now I'm a little bit confused, David, because I was on board with you when you said that your position was somewhere between the buffoon and the prig. But you admitted that when it came to jokes that were highly immoral, or wisecracks that were highly immoral, but also funny, that both reasons are present. But now it sounds like you're saying they're not. You're saying that sufficient immorality is enough to overrule the funniness of something. I also just want to clarify what you mean by funny. Do you mean this is the weighted overall judgment of what our best response is? So you've got the moral reason, you've got the humor reason, they're both playing a role, and then we weight them in a certain way. And I'd really like to understand how you weight that. But you weight them in a certain way against each other. You come up with an ultimate value judgment, and that value judgment informs your response. Is that response what you're calling whether the joke is funny or not? Because then I understand what you're saying when you say that there's sufficient immorality that would outrule funniness. But if I understood correctly, in the beginning of your discussion, you were saying that the humor, the reason to laugh, is always present, even in it could be present even in the most immoral jokes. It's just the overall weighted response would be, no, that's not funny.
So I think that sufficient immorality can, in fact, eliminate all humor. But a lot of the time, when there is immorality in some wisecrack, that the wisecrack can still be funny. So I'm thinking here of something like take pranks. And one example I give and talk about in the book is the prank that was done on Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, where her evil classmates make her believe that she's the prom queen, and as she's standing there basking in the glory, they dump a bucket of pig's blood on her. Now, I think this is an unbelievably cruel prank. Ordinarily, pranks might have some funny in them, although I think that's the lowest form of humor, but they may have some funny in them. But when there is sufficient cruelty involved, I think it eliminates all of the humor. Now, psychopaths, for one, are people who say, no, it's got this prank, so it's got a joke like a wisecrack like structure to it, so it must have some funny in it, and then they think the funny just eliminates all of the worries about immorality. I think that's a mistake. So very often when we're engaged in wisecracks with one another, the reasons from the funny, the domain of the comic, still do obtain, as do the reasons from the immoral or moral. They still do obtain, and there's a outweighing of one over the other. And I'll say something about that in a second, because I didn't respond to Travis earlier on that. But sometimes just outright cruelty can completely destroy any kind of humor. So I was thinking in this imaginary race of people, a group of people, that had they lost all capacity for empathy, then they're just not like us sufficiently. They might have some different theory of humor. Maybe they're amused by certain kinds of things, but it's just not ours. So it's a deeply anthropocentric theory in that respect. When it comes to the weighing, I can't give you an algorithm, and I can't, because to do so would be to give a kind of first order theory of the funny, and I just don't have that, and I think it's impossible to give. The most I can give is a theory that explains why we can't give a first order theory of the funny, and also points to some of the objective properties in the world that sometimes in some contexts contribute to their funniness. And what I really am trying to emphasize in the book is that there are values associated with wisecracking and humor that have been undervalued, that have been underappreciated, and that there are reasons that stem from the comic domain that can weigh against certain kinds of moral reasons. The trick is to figure out which one weighs more than the other. And I don't think there's any algorithm for that. I don't think there's any way we can do that other than to, again, consult our senses of humor, try to view things in an unobstructed way, make sure that we've figured out how best to get our tastes to have good discriminatory power, all of that. But even so, at the end of the day, there can be this blameless disagreement between people on fundamental matters.
So I want to return to the Carrie case. I think it's a great example. I have a problem with your account because it seems to not explain why people are laughing in that case. So So Carrie gets a bucket full of blood dropped on her in her beautiful prom dress that she was previously enjoying immensely a moment earlier. She's the queen of the ball. She's having a great night, and then they dump a bucket of blood on her, and everyone laughs. Now, if I were to ask a common sense Joe on the street, why are they laughing? He would say, that's funny. And then I'd say, but should they be laughing? And he says, no, probably not. But it's still funny. On your view, it's not funny. And that seems to then leave an open question. Why are they laughing? And I don't think your account could give an answer to that.
So in this case, it's teenagers. And teenagers can be like the ancient Romans. So they can make mistakes, serious mistakes about the funny. And I think what fools people most of the time is that when they're laughing or they're finding funny things that aren't funny, what they're doing is tracking certain kinds of structures that in other contexts are funny. This is the problem with people who try to point to there's a single objective property out there, and whenever you see it, that's the funny maker, and it's not. So pranks in other contexts where the stakes are low have some funny in them. And I think the mistake that people make is to say, even when the stakes are incredibly high, if it's got this structure, maybe there's some funny in it. And I think that in these kinds of cases, they're not paying sufficient attention to the fact that someone has been cruelly humiliated. Now, I don't have a huge problem, having said that, I don't have a huge problem saying one of the two following things. Sometimes I say it eliminates all the humor. And I'm okay with saying, okay, maybe there's a little funny in it, but it's completely swamped by the cruelty. And I think either of those is compatible with the view that I'm trying to put forward. And so if you talk to the person on the street, yeah, you're right. They may say, well, they're finding it funny because there is some funny in it. But what they're failing to pay sufficient attention to are the massive reasons that are coming from the moral domain that either swamp it or eliminate all that funny. And so, yeah, they shouldn't be laughing. Maybe they shouldn't be laughing because it's just not funny, or maybe they shouldn't be laughing because the immorality swamps it. But I'm fine between those two. And it's a differentiation. I don't think I can defend one or the other, really.
So there's a couple of types of jokes that you discuss where some people have argued like the content or the topic that's being discussed prevents it from being funny. All right. And then some other cases are ones where the social dynamics you might think prevent it from being funny. So with respect to the first category, you might think jokes that play on racist or sexist or other unjustified, morally reprehensible stereotypes are necessarily unfunny. Maybe because the moral reasons there are so great as to cancel the humor reasons. Another type of case that you consider rape jokes and whether those could be funny in any context. You might just think the nature of that is so just morally awful and despicable that it'd be impossible to say something that's genuinely funny. And you have a nice discussion of that in the book. So I was hoping you could talk about those cases.
You're exactly right. The way it's often put is that as soon as someone mentions anything having to do with, let's say, a racial stereotype, that many people will say, start hissing and say, back off, don't even do that. And I think that's a mistake. And that's because I want to lean so heavily on context and intentions or motives of the wisecrackers that to deny that anything appeals or exploits a racial or sexual stereotype can't be funny is a mistake. One way in which it's a mistake is that sometimes people are appealing to these stereotypes in order to undermine them. And they're exploiting everybody's understanding of the stereotype in order to thwart it, to subvert it in some interesting way. So you can't just say you can never exploit these kinds of stereotypes. It's never funny because if people think it's immoral, because it's not sometimes. In fact, it's the way in which we can engage in moral progress. Now, There are other times in which people are exploiting the stereotypes so that they can make fun of bigots who make those stereotypes. This is another kind of contextual way in which the thing can be funny and it's not doing any kind of moral damage. Now, when it comes to the exploitation of stereotypes, there has been some psychological research. Again, it's all on jokes. And the philosophical literature has been just used one joke, and it's a terrible joke. So the way to get to the points I want to make is to think about these kinds of humorous remarks that are made within the context of relationships. And depending on what we know about one another, depending on what our relationship is, depending on what our motives and intentions are, it can be perfectly okay to engage in this kind of humor with close friends to the extent that you're maybe working to undermine or subvert the stereotype, or you're making fun of the bigots who might appeal to these stereotypes, or when you know and you're clear in your knowledge that you don't mean it. Now, the issue with finding the funny in rape, which is just, it sounds horrible when said out loud, but it's the kind of thing that many professional comedians have tried to provide counterexamples to this thought. And if you look at the kinds of jokes that they make, they're not making fun of rape, they're actually making fun of various other aspects of our society. But there were several groups that formed in Canada. These are comedy troupes that formed in Canada and the US, and they toured with rape survivors. And they were people who went on stage and talked about the experience and tried to do so in a humorous way. Now, what they're doing is they're part of a particular context. And it's this certain kind of shared background between the performers and the audience. And people were saying funny things in this domain that pertain directly to rape. So in all of these cases, I think people are worried about how easily one might go from exploiting certain stereotypes for purposes of humor or that will subvert the stereotype to exploiting the stereotype in a way that will affirm the stereotype. And people are very worried about that slide, and they don't want to be complicit in that possible slide. And so they just back off the instant that any of these remarks are being made. It's very nervous making. But again, I want to defend the possibility that there are contexts in which these things can be funny. And what's crucial about them are part of the values of wisecracking, which is that it bonds people. It helps unite people. And in the case of the rape survivors, helps unite them, brings them together in solidarity of a very important sort. And what they themselves say is that it busts certain taboos. So that if people say you can never joke about rape, what that does is keep rape as this taboo thing that we can't talk about ever, and isolates people who are survivors, who have been assaulted. And what the humorous community can do is to bring people together, bring people out from their isolation, bring them into solidarity with one another, and it helps unite them against the evil people in the world. So there are values to the humor and wisecracking that I think have been, as I say, underappreciated, that are brought out by some of these examples, and that I think when people engage in this kind of humor with one another, it can be incredibly positive and contribute well to their well-being.
Something that you just raised is very interesting, is this notion of the in-group member versus the out-group member in making a joke. So the rape survivors can make jokes about rape to a greater extent, perhaps because they're rape survivors. Where someone who's not, it seems there's probably a line that's a lot closer that they can't cross. You can tell a joke that borders on immorality to a greater extent if you're part of the in-group that you're mocking than if you're not. Why is that?
That's a really good question, and I haven't explored it in any detail. All I've noted is what you've just described, that there's a powerful form of solidarity that can be generated between people against others. Now, obviously, that's the sort of thing that can be bad, very bad as well, because it's exclusionary, right? So all I can do is really point to these values of solidarity. I'm not exactly sure why, except other than to say that there's something about context and relationships that creates a certain kind of safe space, where we don't have to worry about one another's intentions or motives. We know what they are. I mean, I think here of two very, very close friends who are constantly faux insulting each other, that to any outsider would look cruel. But because of the bonds of the relationship, they know everything's cool here. And so that's what's going on, I think, in groups, is that they've created a safe space where we don't have to worry about your intentions because we know you've got good intentions here.
Do we have to worry not only about the intentions, but the sort of consequentialist reasons at play here, the effects that it might have on audience members or people who could hear the joke, who might not pick up or care about the intentions and could inadvertently perpetuate harmful stereotypes? So you discussed the famous Chris Rock routine where he uses the N-word, and I think Dave Chappelle has also done some skits that he later regretted because of the effects that it had on people, where they weren't picking up on the intentions and in fact took it as a sort of way for racist people to engage or endorse or play with racist stereotypes in a way that's harmful.
Yeah, I think Chappelle said that he heard a crew member laughing in the wrong way at one of the skits very famous skits that he put on the Dave Chappelle show. So the consequentialist considerations I want to take very seriously, and those are the kinds of considerations that people in the philosophical literature, for example, have pressed, that there could be these bad effects on audience members who aren't sussing out the intentions properly from the person who's, in my case, wisecracking. So there are two things here. One is that this is basically an empirical claim that there are likely to be these kinds of bad effects, and there have been some evidence that has been put forward. It's all been about jokes, of course, but there have been studies that seem to show that if people already have a certain inclination to racism or sexism, that being exposed to a racist or sexist joke cranks up the racism or sexism a little bit more. There's also evidence that shows that people who are anti-racist, anti-sexist, that if they hear that joke, it actually has no effect on them, or it cranks up the anti-racism, anti-sexism. That is to say, it has a positive effect, right, on their attitudes towards others. So the evidence here is actually quite mixed about what, all things considered, we should allow for comedians say, or even wisecracking. The other aspect here is I worry a bit about an argument that says there may be a percentage of the audience, or in this case, your friends, who take it the wrong way. And that itself should be a powerful reason for why you shouldn't engage in the humor. I'm reminded of the argument that was given maybe less than 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, for not allowing gays in the military. And the argument was, well, if you allow gays in the military, they're going to be picked on and beaten up by straight members. And so for their own good, we should not allow gays in the military. And that seems to me to be the wrong sort of reasoning here. What you need to do is ensure that the other soldiers do not pick on or beat up gay soldiers, their fellow soldiers. So I have a reaction that's kind of initially a pushback on the thought that, well, because someone might take it in the wrong way, that you shouldn't engage in the humor. Because maybe they shouldn't be taken in the wrong way. Maybe they're in the wrong, and so it might be that the humor is in the right. That being said, there are other reasons in play here, and they have to do with knowing your audience and not engaging in a certain kind of humor that may offend the audience. I have in mind my grandparents, who used to be there when they were alive. They were very, very deeply religious people. They didn't like any mention of body parts when anyone was around them. So it made Thanksgiving kind of awkward. Would you like a leg or a breast, Grandma? No, you can't say that. But nevertheless, I knew they'd be upset if they heard these kinds of words, so I avoided it because I didn't want to upset them. So there is that aspect that's relevant here too, that there might be people who are in fact unreasonably upset, but there's no overriding reason to make them upset in some circumstances. So it's complicated as usual.
So my missing co-host, who Travis is doing a great job of replacing, Mark, is a very avid free speech proponent. And he might agree with you all the way in everything you've said. So he might say to you, okay, it is the case that certain jokes are not funny because they're immoral. Okay, there might be reasons not to give a joke or not to give a wisecrack because it'll hurt someone. Okay, the immorality of certain jokes scrubs out its humor entirely or mostly, sufficiently that there's no reason to give the joke. But we still shouldn't ban those jokes. We shouldn't stop those jokes. And I would climb on board together with him in this claim, because I would say, well, perhaps there is immorality involved, but it's very minor. So my view is that the kind of hurt that you can cause through a joke is actually very small. You might say, for example, okay, you could reinforce stereotypes, which ultimately could cause the sort of societies that we had in the past that were extremely damaging to people of color, for example. But it seems the problem there is the societies that damage people of color and those rules and regulations that were imposed, not any jokes that were made. The jokes are not the problem. It's further down the causal line. And you might say, well, there's a slippery slope here. You start with a joke and soon you've got slavery. But firstly, I just don't think in today's world that that's a possibility. So I just don't think in today's world that in our world that seems over-policed on joking, that any such slippery slope could happen. But also, like in cases you gave earlier, it doesn't seem like the problem is the joke. It seems like the problem is what seems to come afterwards. So in the case of the disallowing gay men from being in the army because they could be hurt by other people, by straight men, the problem seems to be the policing of straight men hurting gay people, not that we should take it one step earlier, which is not allow gay people in the army at all. So I just think the amount of hurt that can be inflicted through a distasteful joke is so minor that, yes, it's immoral, but not immoral enough to scrub out much of the humor. So in other words, I'm agreeing with you that there's two different reasons here. There's the moral reason or the immoral reason, and there's the humor reason, and that they can conflict at times and that the one can outweigh the other. I'm just saying that the moral reason's never that bad. It never provides much weight.
So two things. One is that I would not argue for the legal banning of any kind of humor. So I'd be a free speech absolutist in that respect. So the only question I'm concerned with is whether or not, all things considered, it would be immoral to engage in this kind of humor, and that immorality can come from a variety of directions. One is what's in the wisecrack itself, say it's deception or stereotype exploitation, and what I was suggesting about my grandparents, it may come from another domain, which is don't cause unreasonable anxiety in people that you love. So I'm all on board with not the banning part, but I do want to maintain that there can be some instances in which there'll be context and motive that determines whether or not it's, all things considered, immoral to engage in.
I think my point is that it's never that immoral. In other words, even if you give me the worst situation, so like, okay, you're at Christmas dinner and you're talking about legs and arms of chickens, and you know that your parents or your grandparents don't like it, and I find that funny. When you gave that situation, I found that funny. We have our sound switched off when the guest is talking, so none of the listeners heard me laughing, but I found that funny. So even the setup is funny. but you'd be causing some discomfort, which is immoral. But is it that immoral? It's a little bit. I might do it just for kicks, like in your situation, in your shoes. I think pushing people a little bit to feel a bit of discomfort could be immoral, but quite valuable in other ways. What I'm trying to say is, how bad can it get? How bad can a joke get?
Well, Carrie is I think, one extreme case. Even if you want to hold on to there being a little bit of funny in that prank, it's horrifying. And she's being humiliated there, and then she destroys the town, of course, with her telekinetic powers thereafter. So there's some satisfaction in the revenge that she gets. But nevertheless, that's pretty horrifying. And you can imagine just, other kinds of cases in which you get closer and closer to that. Think of the kind of bullying, mockery that kids engage in with each other. They may be saying things that have some funny in it, but it can be horribly traumatic for kids. Say, for someone to be standing in the middle of a circle around which all people are pointing and saying "Shoemaker, poo maker," let's just say hypothetically, which was horrifying, somewhat traumatic. But there are much worse instances of that. And in fact, I want to say, in the cases that you're thinking of where there's some discomfort, a sting maybe that's involved, I think those can be very valuable. And I think of mockery of a certain sort as a kind of unexplored avenue of blame, where it serves this incredibly valuable function of getting people to toe the line again. What you're doing in mocking somebody is you're saying you failed with respect to some standard here, typically a skill-based standard. You failed. And being laughed at in that mocking way gets people to toe the line in the future much better than does a finger-wagging sermon. This is a point that Francis Hutcheson insightfully made. So I think that the cases in which there is small discomfort can actually yield great benefits if it's handled in a certain sort of way. But I also think that there are cases in which people can be severely hurt by some kind of mockery and bullying.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this and what the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions are for counting as mockery or counting as a wisecrack, counting as different forms of humor. And one thing that, if I understood you correctly, and maybe I didn't, is that some wisecracks that you talk about are going to necessarily involve some bit of meanness or trying to like take some hot air out of the balloon, some deception. All right. So one example that you use is at dinner, I believe, with your colleagues. Chair of the department, David Sobel, is going over all of your great accomplishments as you're going up for tenure. And another colleague chimes in and says, that's why it makes us so much harder to tell you that you're not getting tenure. Nor do I think they're even taking themselves to imply that you don't deserve tenure, right? Because you clearly do. So I just seemed like that was a case where there's not, it is in fact a wisecrack, but I don't see how there's meanness or deception involved in that wisecrack. And I think there's lots of other examples that would fit that same criteria.
Yeah, good. I don't mean for all wisecracks to contain some immoral element. I think lots of wisecracks contain no immoral properties whatsoever. It can be very funny. This might be a case in which he was maybe pulling my leg a little bit, but that's not necessary for the example, which was just to try to set up a discussion of what makes things funny. Why would it be funny to go down this path in the way that this person did? So two separate issues here. One is the nature of wisecracks versus jokes. And I don't think that I can give you necessary and sufficient conditions. I can give you a rough characterization of the differences, but they of course bleed into one another. There's some comedians who engage in a kind of wisecrackery with the audience, and some of the wisecracks that I make might just be applied directly from what I heard a comedian say. So they bleed into one another, but just a rough and ready distinction. So the wisecracking just has to do with interpersonal banter and back and forth teasing. And sometimes it involves a kind of mockery. Sometimes it involves a kind of deception. Sometimes it involves some stereotype exploitation, but not always. Mockery is an instance of wisecracking in which I'm making fun of someone for failure to live up to some standard, typically, or to take the wind out of their sails, as you were suggesting. And what I'm doing is drawing public attention to that failure. And in drawing public attention to someone's failure, where the expected response is a kind of embarrassment, shame, or even humiliation, is to do something that, without the humor, we would think of as a kind of meanness. If I'm deliberately drawing public attention to your failure in order to get you to feel those negative feelings, I'm doing something wrong, it seems. Prima pro tanto, wrong. If I add the humor in, then sometimes the humor can outweigh the embarrassment that you feel, and it might have these good effects down the road.
I'm curious about the weighing of morality and humor, the two reasons. And what you said was you don't have an algorithm for this. You don't have a ready answer to what that weighting is. But I assume that you think there is a right answer to that. It's just very difficult to know what it is. What I'm curious about is that answer different in the case of wisecracks versus jokes? And the reason I think about this is because in the case of jokes, it's pre-prepared, right? So Louis C.K. stands up and delivers a joke that he's worked on. If the joke, on your view, lands up to be immoral, it seems like we can condemn that in a more severe way than if a wisecrack turns out to be immoral, because the wisecrack wasn't thought about long in advance. It wasn't premeditated. It's kind of the difference between manslaughter and murder. It's kind of like it's like a reflex reaction, the wisecrack, versus and it's not thought out, it's not premeditated, versus the joke is developed in the basement for hours, it's delivered to lots of people, it's considered, and then you do the immoral thing anyway. So is it a different formula in the two cases?
I think there's something to that. Especially given that I want to lean heavily on motivations and intentions, that when we're in the midst of a back and forth, say we're in the midst of a back and forth quarrel, I might say something in the heat of the moment, as we say, that really hurts you, that I would say, oh man, I really didn't mean it that way, or I didn't intend for it to come off that harshly. It was just, we're flying back and forth. And I think that that should get me off the hook, maybe not all the way, but it mitigates the blame that you can rightfully direct in my way. Whereas you're right, the person who has spent days and days crafting, a Seinfeld who is crafting all the time, rewriting, that person has spent a lot of time putting together this prepared joke. It might well be that when they present it and it crosses a moral line, that the blame does hang on them and there's not that mitigating factor. In that case, notice that there's an intention, and the intention does attach to the joke when it's told. The joke in and of itself on the page, I'm not sure has that same kind of moral status. That is to say, I'm kind of an amoralist about jokes. I don't think they are moral or immoral. I think it's only when they're put in someone's mouth or they've intended to write it and distribute it that then we're in a more of a wisecracking domain. Something's being told here in a way that intentions matter. And it might be that I just repeat somebody else's joke in a context in which I'm aiming to direct it at somebody, and I know it's going to hurt. And there can be that's an additional bad-willed, blamable offense.
That's very interesting. And I think it explains why we're disagreeing and maybe agreeing underneath. So let's take the Carrie case, right? So the question is, what is the joke? The term "the joke," what does that refer to? Does it refer to their laughter? Does it refer to the planning of the dunking of the blood on her? Does it refer to the actual dunking of the blood? Then another case that you described, like the bullying. So you've got all these kids standing around in a circle, pointing at David, saying, "Poo poo Shoemaker." Okay, so what is the joke there? Is it just the sentence, "Poo poo Shoemaker," which you laughed at, right? It does seem to be funny, but the rest of that situation is not funny. The rest of that situation seems quite hurtful, and damaging. So what is the joke? When we talk about the joke, what does that refer to? Is it the entirety of all of that? Is it just the propositions uttered? And it seems like we could say the propositions uttered are funny or amoral, right? Because you could just write them on paper and say, well, that is objectively interesting, that's funny, or given the scenario, that's funny. But in this context, if you describe the context as being part of the joke, well, now our evaluation changes.
Yes, that's exactly right. The people who've written about jokes, I think you hear of John Morial and Noel Carroll, the most influential writers. They differentiate between joke types and joke tokens, and they think that joke types themselves, in and of themselves, can't be appraised. They're like recipes, they say. And so it's only when I make the recipe that then we appraise it. So, but that just strikes me as utterly false. I can read a recipe and know it's a good or bad recipe without having actually executed it. And if I do execute it, it's a different set of evaluative standards, right? It's about whether or not I executed this recipe well. We can evaluate joke types and joke tokens, but wisecracks are all tokens in that respect. And so they include not just the propositions that are uttered, but the context and what I think is crucial, the intentions or motives of the teller. So joke types are like the jokes just written down on the page, and you can evaluate them because you can do them, say, relative to an incongruity theory. You can say, oh, what this does is exploiting certain patterns and undermining them in what would be an unexpected way. And some of them do that better than others. So there are jokes that are funnier than others. But because there's no intention attached to the joke in and of itself, especially jokes, we don't know who wrote them, so we don't know what their intentions were for the most part, setting aside professional comedians. Because there's no intention there, there's no moral evaluation, I think, in terms of the kind of blame and anger that we reserve for people in virtue of their intentions and motives.
So we talked about whether certain topics are off limits. What about making jokes that might affect different groups that have different social standings in different ways? So that's a convoluted way to put it, but the rule that a lot of people appeal to is that you should punch up, so to speak, but not punch down. So it could be okay, for instance, for somebody to make a joke about a member of a group that they're a part of, because that wouldn't involve punching down. But it would not be okay for somebody that's in a more privileged group to make fun of groups that are have a lower place among the social order, wrongly, of course.
Yeah, the punching up down distinction is especially favored by people on the political left. And I discussed it in the book relative to something like mockery, and in particular, mocking people for their disabilities. And so the objection and what people take to be an absolute constraint on a certain kind of mockery is if it punches down. And that's taken to be directed by people who have a certain kind of power, privilege, and authority towards people who don't have power, privilege, or authority. And those are typically taken to be people with social identities that have had in the past or today, they've been marginalized or oppressed. The problem, I think, with that metaphor is that it is so thoroughly ideologically driven that it's actually difficult, if not impossible, to list who in fact is up and who in fact is down. Now, that's in part because up and down are comparatives. It's like tallness. So I can't say that someone is tall, full stop. I have to say you're only tall relative to some comparison class. So I'm tall relative to my grandkids. I used to be, grown up. And I'm short relative to NBA players if I go to an NBA game. So the same thing is true of power, privilege, and authority. These are all comparatives. It's only so Putin has power over his citizens, but he has no power over or authority over the citizens of Bali, say, or the citizens of the United States. depending on who's in power. And same thing goes for privilege and authority. So it's only relative to some comparison class. And it turns out that we all have some power and some privilege and authority relative to some comparison class, and we lack power, privilege, and authority relative to other comparison classes. And so people on the political left want to point to certain kinds of groups as those who are down. People on the right actually appeal to this metaphor, and they have very different people in mind when they're saying who's up and who's down. So in academia, for example, they think that people who are down are those who are religious, especially Christian, and those who are politically conservative. So it depends on where you're coming from, who you think is up and who's down. And because of the comparison class issue, there's just no way to, I think, deliver the goods on who's in fact up and who's in fact down. So it doesn't deliver any practical advice. So I much prefer, if we're going for metaphors here, for what are possibly absolute constraints against certain kind of mockery, I much prefer the metaphor of piling on. So if what you're doing is piling on someone in a way that forces them to bear some weight that no reasonable person should have to bear, then you can't do that. You got to stop. And that is not restricted to members of specific social identity groups. That cuts across all identity groups, I think, to anyone who's just constantly picked on, say, for having a big nose or for having some feature that hasn't made them part of some social identity group. And what it does is constrain, I think, absolutely, picking on people who shouldn't have to bear being picked on in that way. It kind of winds up matching what some people want, extensionally, what people want to say, here's groups you shouldn't mock, but it doesn't in other ways. And I think that's the kind of constraint that we should go with instead. It's much easier to say who's been piled on and who hasn't, versus who's down or who's up.
Well, David, I want to thank you for appearing on the show and engaging in a fascinating conversation. And at the risk of getting the immorality and humor balance wrong, I want to attempt a wisecrack. I thought that something you mentioned earlier would be comedy gold for a film or a TV series, which is a philosopher of humor arguing with his wife about what's funny and what's not. I think that there's a great story in there somewhere, and it needs to be written. But thank you very much for being on the show. Thank you, Travis, for filling in as a co-host. I thought you were great. And yeah, David, you're very welcome back.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure.